You can get every one of these GRE reading comprehension practice questions right without fully understanding the passage that they're based on. I'm going to show you how. I'm Erika with Target Test Prep, and today we're going to break down 3 extra hard GRE reading comprehension questions, as well as the passage that they're associated with. Along the way, I'm going to teach some of my favorite GRE reading comprehension strategies for breaking down complex passages and setting yourself up for success on the questions. Let's jump in. All right, first up, you're going to notice that I'm starting with the passage instead of the question. And notably, this is the first paragraph of 3 because I can't fit all of them on the slide at once. Now, while I personally like to read the question first on a single question critical reasoning style passage, when I'm dealing with a multi-question reading comprehension passage, I like to read the passage first to ensure I have a solid baseline for any of the questions that come up. So that's what we're doing here. Now, for a 3-paragraph passage like this one, I likely want to allow myself around 3 to 4 minutes to read. And that's going to be about a minute per question for a passage of this length. So this means I have plenty of time to get through the passage, but probably not enough time to reread. So I'm going to make sure that I'm processing as I go at the end of each sentence, at the end of each paragraph. Similarly, there are going to be sentences and parts of sentences that I read more closely because I think they're important. And there are going to be parts that I read less closely because I think I have a pretty good handle on what they're doing and I can save myself some time. All right, starting with my first sentence. In 1809, a half century before Charles Darwin proposed his theory of evolution, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed that evolution occurs as organisms develop new physical traits during their lifetimes and then pass those traits on to their offspring. Pause. Okay, we have got a technical passage on our hands. Now, if you've got a biology degree like I do, or you remember your high school coursework, this may sound familiar. If so, great. This passage will likely be easier to comprehend. You'll just want to be careful to stay in context of the passage when you answer the questions. But if, on the other hand, you're thinking, I don't know any of this stuff and it scares me. That is also okay because you don't actually need to understand this stuff. What you do need to understand is the role this stuff plays in the passage as a whole. So, applying that principle to this sentence, in 1809, that's a descriptive phrase. It's not super important. A half century before Charles Darwin proposed his theory of evolution, that's another descriptive phrase. So again, not super important. But this part is going to be our main clause. So we're going to start paying attention. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed that evolution occurs. And then all of this is Lamarck's theory. And that's as much as I need to understand for now, that this stuff is Lamarck's theory. I don't actually need to understand what that theory is, what it means. Now, I am going to note some key words and phrases in this theory. So, develop new physical traits during their lifetimes, pass those traits on to their offspring. And that's because this is the first sentence of the whole passage, which means that this theory is very likely going to be pretty central to the main idea of the passage and will likely come up again later in the passage. So, by noting these words and phrases, later in the passage, when I see them again, I'll know, hey, this is Lamarck's theory. I don't understand it, but I know that we're talking about it. All right, second sentence. However, okay, we're going to pause again. This is contrast language. So I know that whatever comes next in this sentence is going to go against whatever I saw in the previous sentence. This is important. Anytime we have strong contrast language, we want to pay close attention. So locking in. However, with the discovery of genetics in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, okay, this is another descriptive phrase, but here comes the main clause. It seemed, interesting, that Lamarck's theory had been completely refuted. So, completely refuted is obviously quite negative language, and it obviously goes against Lamarck's theory. So, this tracks with the however we saw earlier. But there's also this word seemed. That's tone language. And it suggests that maybe actually Lamarck's theory wasn't completely refuted. and instead that the theory was just thought to be completely refuted. I would bet that later in the passage, based on this, we get something that actually supports Lamarck's theory in some way. So I'm going to keep that in mind. Okay, moving on to our next sentence. We start with during that time period. All right, pause. We're not getting strong contrast here. We're, in fact, getting a suggestion that we are going to expand on what we learned before. So that time period is a reference back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So we are likely going to be discussing the discovery of genetics and the seeming refutation of Lamarck's theory. So we can read on a bit to confirm, but we're going to go into the sentence with the knowledge that this is just further information building on the previous sentence. And so it's not as important as a sentence that would contrast in some way. During that time period, biologists decided, there's some more of that tone language, suggesting again that maybe this refutation is not 100% true, that all physical traits are passed from parents to offspring by means of information encoded in genetic material, and that such information is unaffected by an organism's development of traits during its lifetime. Pause. Okay, so there's actually no need to dig particularly deep here. Because this is a continuation of the previous sentence, we know that all of this stuff that biologists decide is stuff that refutes Lamarck's theory, or at least seems to. And that's all we really need to do here. Now, we may also have noticed this language and organism's development of traits during its lifetime, because those are words and phrases from Lamarck's theory, which we noticed earlier. And when we notice that, we may also have noticed unaffected right here. So this is indicating that one of the things biologists decided is that Lamarck's theory has no effect. So this aligns with the idea that it is refuting. But we already knew that from the structure of the sentence. So again, no need to dig particularly deep here. This was just bonus. All right, last sentence of our paragraph can tend to be an important one. First word is since. This is premise language. This suggests this first part is going to be premise, but the last part is going to be conclusion. Classic last sentence stuff. The conclusion part is going to be important. The premise stuff, maybe less so. So we're going to read through it pretty quickly. Since, in arriving at that understanding, biologists had essentially ruled out the existence of a mechanism via which physical traits develop during an organism's lifetime could be passed on to its offspring. Convoluted sentence. But this is the important part. They had made it appear that evolution, as Lamarck had described it, is impossible. So, yes, this last part is the conclusion, and it is the important part, but we're probably noticing that it's actually not new information. It's stuff that we already know from the rest of the passage. The idea that Lamarck's theory is impossible lines up with the idea that it had been completely refuted, and then the tone language and made it appear suggests the same way that seemed and decided did that actually maybe it wasn't completely refuted, maybe it's not completely impossible. So this is stuff we already know. Now, we may also have noticed this language. Physical traits developed during an organism's lifetime could be passed on to its offspring, which again, we might be going, hey, that's Lamarck's theory. And then we might see biologists had essentially ruled out a mechanism for it. So again, we're getting that idea that Lamarck's theory is impossible, is refuted. None of this is new. So all of this supports one idea, which is that Lamarck's theory seems to have been proven wrong. And honestly, that works as a pretty good summary of this paragraph. Now, paragraph summaries are a really good way, one, to check in with yourself and make sure you're actually processing the stuff you're reading, and two, to provide yourself a reference for questions later on. So I'm going to write down for my summary Lamarck's theory seemed wrong, with emphasis on the seemed. All right, that's paragraph one. Moving on to paragraph 2. First sentence starts with however. So we have another contrast. And this time, because it's at the beginning of the paragraph, it is contrasting with the entire previous paragraph. So the last paragraph indicated that Lamarck's theory seemed wrong. Maybe here we'll get something that indicates Lamarck's theory might seem right. Let's find out. However, more recently, such a mechanism. So, such means that we are referring to a mechanism we've seen before. So, if we back up to our previous paragraph and look for the word mechanism, we're going to see that right here. Oh, yeah, that was the mechanism that was aligned with Lamarck's theory that biologists had essentially ruled out, but that we weren't entirely sure was actually ruled out. Okay, so going back to our second paragraph. More recently, such a mechanism has been discovered in the form of modification of gene expression. Pause. Now, again, if you are freaking out because you don't know what modification of gene expression means, you don't have to, because all we have to do is relate it to the information around it in the passage. And we've already done that. We know that this modification of gene expression is the mechanism that supposedly biologists had ruled out, but they didn't. They were wrong. So maybe actually we're seeing some support for Lamarck's theory, but we're not sure yet. So let's keep reading. It has been found. Okay, so we are likely just expanding on what we found or discovered in the previous sentence. So modification of gene expression, and we'll possibly get into how it relates to Lamarck's theory. So we'll keep reading, but again, with the knowledge that this is just expansion, not super duper important. It has been found not only that an organism can modify its gene expression, okay, that's our mechanism, to develop particular physical traits during its lifetime, that's Lamarck's theory, but also that gene expression modifications, that's the mechanism, made during an organism's lifetime, that's Lamarck's theory, and the traits associated with those modifications, okay, traits, Lamarck's theory, modifications, mechanism, bringing it together, can be passed on from the organism to its offspring, Lamarck's theory. So we were absolutely right. We are expanding on how the mechanism, gene expression modification, aligns with Lamarck's theory. We got a lot of keywords all blended together. Moving on. Has Lamarck's evolutionary theory been proven at least somewhat valid? Question mark. All right. The fact that the author has asked a question means, one, that the answer to this question is coming up, and we were wondering about this, so we're going to pay attention, we're going to look alive. And two, that the answer to this question is important to the author, is important to the purpose of this passage. So we're going to pay quite close attention to the upcoming sentences to find the answer to this question. Has Lamarck's evolutionary theory been proven at least somewhat valid? Well, some people contend that it has, but. Okay, pause. Without reading the rest of the sentence, from this kind of negative language, but, we can pretty much conclude that the answer to this question is going to be no. Lamarck's theory has not been proven at least somewhat valid. So even though this mechanism does exist, Lamarck's theory is not valid. Well, why is that? Well, we can keep reading to find out. Some people contend that it has, but most evolutionary biologists point out that such gene expression modifications and their associated traits are typically passed on from organisms to their offspring for only a few generations and eventually disappear. Okay, so we've got some negative language, only a few and disappear, right? And that makes sense because this is negative, right? This is the argument against modification of gene expression supporting Lamarck's theory. So we may not understand what this argument is. We may not understand the relevance here. But at this point, we know that this is the argument they're making. It is because these traits, these modifications and traits eventually disappear. They only persist a few generations. And we know that it is the consensus of most evolutionary biologists. Last sentence. So we've got conclusion language, which suggests that the previous sentence was all premise. And this last sentence is the conclusion. So our ideas that we were working with in the previous sentence are leading to this sentence. This is important. This is probably the point of the entire paragraph. So this type of passing on of traits, the type of passing on of traits we saw in the previous sentence associated with modification of gene expression from generation to generation, does not result in evolution. All right, let's put the pieces together. There is a mechanism, gene expression modification, that seems like it would support Lamarck's theory. However, it doesn't. And that's because the genes only persist a few generations, and that means it does not result in evolution, which is an important thing for an evolutionary theory. So, summarizing that, gene expression modification does not support Lamarck's theory because there is no evolution. Kind of a long summary, but there was a lot going on in this paragraph. All right, last paragraph. Nevertheless, all right, pause again. We have yet another contrast transition word. There has been a lot of flip-flopping in this passage, and we are doing it again. Now, in paragraph 2, we determined that Lamarck's theory was not supported, right? Lamarck's theory is toast, but this nevertheless suggests that that might not be entirely true. There might be something that does support Lamarck's theory. Well, let's read on and find out. Nevertheless, Lamarck's theory has found a sole refuge in the world of a certain few single-celled organisms that have been discovered to be able to change their genes and thus their physical traits in response to environmental factors. Pause. Okay, so we've got some tone language in soul and few that suggests there isn't much here to support Lamarck's theory, but there is, in fact, something, and it's this very small subset of single-celled organisms. Now, again, we don't really need to understand what it is that these single-celled organisms do, just that the fact that they do it supports Lamarck's theory. Okay, reading on. Unlike gene expression modifications, okay, pausing, we have another contrast here, but we're not contrasting with the previous sentence. We're contrasting with gene expression modifications, which again is the last paragraph. All right, so again, remember gene expression modifications was something that did not support Lamarck's theory. Okay, unlike gene expression modifications, these changes made by these organisms during their lifetimes involve changes to the information encoded in genetic material and are passed from generation to generation indefinitely. Pause. All right, so this sentence opens with an explicit contrast to gene expression modifications. So we are primed as we read the rest of the sentence to look for further contrast with gene expression modifications. And we see it at the end of the sentence. Passed from generation to generation indefinitely. Now, we haven't seen the word indefinitely before, but we've seen its opposite. In the previous paragraph with gene expression modifications, we saw that traits were passed from generation to generation and then stopped after a few generations, right? And then they disappeared. This is the opposite. Well, we know from the previous paragraph that the fact that those traits stopped and disappeared was the reason that gene expression modification was not considered evolution, right? And that's why it didn't support Lamarck's theory. So maybe this means that this is evolution and does support Lamarck's theory? Let's read on. Thus, ending the paragraph with a strong conclusion transition word. This is going to be important. All right. Thus, the changes in traits resulting from these organisms, the single-celled organisms from before, changes to their genes truly constitute evolution. Bam. So, to summarize, a few single-celled organisms do support Lamarck's theory. in that what they do constitutes true evolution. Right, now, before we move on to our questions, let's take one more moment to synthesize what we figured out so far. And let's do that by trying to put into words what the purpose of the passage is. What is the author doing in this passage as a whole? And we can utilize our summaries to figure that out. And what comes to me on reviewing my summaries is the following phrase: exploring Lamarck's theory in light of new information. And if you come up with something slightly different, that's totally okay. But there are a few things that we want to capture here. First, we want to capture that the author isn't making a strong argument here. The author isn't completely passive, but they're certainly not advocating particularly forcefully for anything here. And then we also want to include that Lamarck's theory, right, is the focus, and that it is being looked at through the lens of new evidence, right? And that this new evidence is working both with and against the theory, hence why we didn't use particularly strong language in this key verb. Now that we've got a handle on the passage, let's attack the questions. Now, all three of these are among the most missed reading comprehension questions in the Target Test Prep program, but we're going to hit them in order from least to most challenging. All right, pause the video if you want to try this one on your own, and feel free to back the video up to look at our work on the passage. Now, based on the language of the question stem, we can determine that this is a primary purpose question, which means that the correct answer is going to match up pretty closely with our summary of the purpose of the passage. Now, if you'll remember, that was exploring Lamarck's theory in light of new info. Okay, so we have a pretty clear picture of what our answer is going to look like. Diving into our answer choices. Now, A might seem like the correct answer if we had only read the first sentence of the passage, which discusses both Darwin and Lamarck, right? Two competing theories of evolution. But if we've read any more of the passage, and especially if we've done summarization like we have, we know that the passage is focused on just Lamarck's theory and everything else is incidental. Eliminate. All right, B, the first word should set off alarm bells. Proving. This is not an argumentative passage. It is exploring a theory. At most, it's evaluating a theory. But notably, this theory is entirely wrong outside of the one extremely small group, the few single-celled organisms. So certainly this theory is not being proven correct. Eliminate. C. All right, outlining is more in line with the tone of the passage than proving. And as we just established, the theory has been largely refuted over time. But as we also just established, it hasn't been entirely refuted. The last paragraph, one of three paragraphs, is focused on a case in which Lamarck is right. So while this may be correct for the first two paragraphs, it does not work for the third paragraph. This is only partially correct, so we can eliminate it. All right, D. There isn't much to say about this one, except for that it is just wrong. The theory is already developed at the start of the passage, and from there it's just explored. It's just evaluated. So this is not accurate to the passage. Eliminate. So by process of elimination, E must be correct, but let's confirm. Considering is a pretty good match for exploring. How modern evidence, pretty good match for new info, affects the perception of a theory. There's L's theory and affects the perception of is pretty close to in light of. So this is actually really close to our summary and it matches our interpretation of the passage. So this is, in fact, the correct answer. Next question, again, feel free to pause and give this a go on your own. This is an info-based question, so not quite as broad as our last one. Now, the language suggests, indicates that the answer to this question may not be explicitly stated in the passage, but like an inference in critical reasoning, this is something that must be true based on what is stated in the passage. Now, this question stem doesn't give us much else to work with. The evolution of organisms is what Lamarck's theory is about. So this is going to show up everywhere in the passage. That said, we have our paragraph summaries as a guide to evaluate our answer choices. So let's jump in with process of elimination. A, this is a pretty popular answer, but there is one word that makes it distinctly incorrect, and that's many. This is a pretty strong word, a pretty extreme word, so we want to be absolutely sure that it is true based on what's in the passage. And the passage only ever references two means of evolution. That is not many. So we're going to go ahead and eliminate. All right, B, starting off with more strong, more extreme language with no multi-celled organisms evolved by passing traits that they have developed during their lifetimes onto their offspring. So this is also feeling quite extreme, but we don't want to eliminate it right off the bat. We just want to look at it closely. So we can be skeptical, but we're still going to evaluate it. All right, so this is about multi-celled organisms. Now, that language does not appear anywhere in the passage, but the opposite of multi-celled does, because the opposite of multi-celled is single-celled. And that shows up in paragraph 3 pretty prominently. So that is likely where we are looking for the answer, and likely something that we know that is stated explicitly about single-celled organisms will help us to infer something about multi-celled organisms. So we want to evaluate whether any multi-celled organisms ever evolve by passing traits that they have developed during their lifetimes onto their offspring. Well, we know that language. That is Lamarck's theory. Okay, well, we know in paragraph 3 that the only refuge for his theory, the sole case in which organisms evolve by passing traits they've developed during their lifetimes onto their offspring, is these few single-celled organisms. Now, if these are the only case, again, the sole refuge for this theory, then that means that there are no other organisms that evolve via this mechanism, which means that there are no multi-celled organisms that evolve via this mechanism. So this must be true. Even though there is quite extreme language, even though looking at it, this looks wrong, it must be true based on the passage. Now, before we pick this one, let's eliminate our other answers for good measure. C is not a popular answer, which makes sense because there is absolutely nothing in the passage to suggest that evolution is not possible in any case. So we're just going to eliminate this one. Now, D, on the other hand, is a popular answer. In fact, it is even more popular than the correct answer. And the reason for that is this word sometimes. This is the exact kind of vague language that we typically like in an answer that must be true, that's suggested. And that's because it's easier for something vague to be true than something quite strong, quite extreme. But despite being vague, this answer is explicitly untrue. We know from paragraph 3 that it's because traits are passed down indefinitely in our special single-celled organisms that they are examples of true evolution. And we know that this is in direct contrast to paragraph 2, where we see that because traits disappear after a few generations in cases of gene expression modification, i.e. they are not passed from generation to generation indefinitely, that they are not examples of evolution. Therefore, we can infer that the indefinite nature of passing down traits is necessary for something to be classed as evolution. So even though this answer choice is nice and vague, it presents the opposite of something that we can infer from the passage. In this case, this vague language was a trap, not a clue. Eliminate. And then finally, E, again, we see a most that we need to prove. And there's just nothing to indicate that most evolution involves traits that aren't physical. In fact, there really isn't any discussion of traits beyond the physical in the passage. We can't prove this. Eliminate. So the correct answer was, in fact, B. Tricky one. All right, last and most missed question. As always, feel free to pause and try this one solo. We have got a structure question here, specifically one that looks at the relationship between the second and third paragraphs of the passage. So this is a really great opportunity to bring out our paragraph summaries to inform what we're looking for in our answer. So our second paragraph summary was that gene expression modification does not support Lamarck's theory. And that's because there is no evolution in that case. Our third paragraph summary is that a few single cell organisms do support Lamarck's theory. And that is because they are true evolution. So already we can see that there is some contrast between these two, and we're going to look for an answer choice that reflects that kind of contrast. Let's check out our answer choices. All right, A should be pretty immediately obviously wrong. And that's because of expands on. This suggests that the paragraphs agree with each other. And even without our summaries, the nevertheless at the beginning of paragraph 3 tells us that they contrast. Easy, eliminate. All right, B, the word rebuttal here does fit with the idea of contrast, but it goes too far. The third paragraph doesn't counter the second paragraph. It doesn't prove anything wrong about the second paragraph. It just presents a different case with a different interpretation. Eliminate. All right, C is pretty much a dead ringer for our summaries. We have a scientific development being presented in the third paragraph, so that's these few single-celled organisms. We've got another scientific development being presented in the second paragraph, that's gene expression modification, and they both have implications that contrast. So the implication in the third paragraph is that it does support Lamarck's theory. The implication in the second paragraph is that it does not support Lamarck's theory. So this is looking really solid. Let's go ahead and check out our other answer choices before we pick it, though. Now, the reason why I want to look at these other answer choices is because 60% of test takers pick D, which is nearly 3 times as many test takers as pick C. And I get why people pick D. I think it's largely this word here, exception, because this pulls on the idea that there aren't many cases of true evolution that align with Lamarck's theory, right? We've got this word few, right? We had sole refuge in our paragraph. And because of this, we could say that the third paragraph provides an exception to the statement of generality that evolution does not occur via Lamarck's theory. And if that particular statement, that evolution does not occur via Lamarck's theory, did ever appear in the second paragraph, this would be a great answer. But the second paragraph never says that. What the second paragraph does say generally is that gene expression modification is not evolution, that gene expression modification does not support Lamarck's theory. And we know in the third paragraph that the evolution that these few single-celled organisms undergo is unlike gene expression modification. So this third paragraph is not an exception. Like in answer choice B, it's just a different case. So really tough one, but we can eliminate it. And then kind of a similar thing is going on in E as in D. There's nothing to qualify. Both paragraphs are true. They just contrast. So once again, we can eliminate. And this means we can confidently pick C as our answer. So, how'd you do? Let us know your score out of 3 in the comments. And if this video helped you, you can help us by giving it a like and subscribing for more videos like it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.